it looks like they pretty much just left me with no one else, so I'll just get started. So, using SaltStack in highly available environments. You're probably first wondering, who is this guy, right? Who am I? So, my name is Ben. I run a blog, and I have a very inventive name for my blog. It's just my name. And that's kind of what I do by night. But by day, I am a solutions architect, and I work in the financial services industry. And I solely focus on highly available environments. So 4 nines, 5 nines, 6 nines, only that. I don't worry about anything less than that, which is kind of nice sometimes, but also, you know, very focused. And of course, my work has made me add the little note that the views and opinions of this are all mine and not theirs. So just keep that in mind. So what I'm going to talk today is running SaltStack in high availability environments. And I probably am not going to, you know, blow your mind with amazing SaltStack capabilities. Maybe, maybe not. This is more just best practices for how to run it in HA environment, right? So what is HA, right? High availability. So you have a nice little Wikipedia entry from here, but really high availability is a system that's been designed to be available the majority of the time. So kind of what is the majority of the time? A lot of times people ask me, you know, oh, well, you know, what's the availability percent and how much is that downtime and whatnot? And I totally stole this chart from Wikipedia. But you have your availability percents on one side and the downtime per year. So, you know, I'll start at 4 nines. But, you know, 4 nines is 52 minutes per year, which is not much time down, right? 5 nines is 5.26, and so on and so forth. It gets even smaller as you go, right? I like to look at this chart whenever I'm thinking about anything that I'm doing that has to have a very high availability and look at how small that number really is, right? And what that really means. I have people say, oh, well, you know, if this happens, we could just, you know, page someone and have them join a bridge and bring up a database or whatever, you know, manually, and that doesn't really work because, you know, that person might be at the movies, right? And they get the page and they're like, oh, crap, and they have to run to their car. You know, you're talking 20 minutes before that person's on a bridge. Well, if you're running 5 nines, well, sorry, you already broke your SLA by the time that person got to their laptop, right? So availability, kind of important for a lot of people, but what number in this list is appropriate for everyone kind of depends. You know, it depends on what you're doing. I work in the financial sector, so a lot of the stuff that I manage is moving money, and money means a lot to companies, right? There's legal things going through it. You know, if something doesn't happen at a certain time, then my company has to, you know, go talk to the government of that country and say, hey, sorry. You know, it's not really what they like doing, right? So what really causes downtime? Well, humans. You know, I've looked at a couple of studies, and really the consensus is humans and hardware are about even, which is kind of surprising, but not that surprising. And I've seen some that even say humans are a bit above. So it kind of depends on what study you look at. But yeah, humans usually cause the problem, right? So my solution, well, get into the best practices. Replace humans with replace manual processes with something like SaltStack, configuration management, right? Humans are flawed. You know, we break things all the time. You know, I'm not going to ask you guys to raise your hand if you ever broke something in production, because I already know you're all going to raise your hand. And if you haven't, you will soon. Very soon, no. So when you replace humans with automated processes, going all over the place. One of the first things you should probably look at replacing them in, the first processes to replace, is building and provisioning, right? So personally, I don't care if you use SaltStack, CF Engine, or all the other guys, right? But I like SaltStack, and most likely you guys like SaltStack if you're here. Really, you want to use some kind of configuration management tool in your build and provisioning deployments, right? You want to have your build be automated so you can not only get it quicker, but more importantly in HA, not the time that it takes to get that server there, and which you'll hear a lot of, that's the new thing, right, is how fast can you get things out. Well, for me, configuration management is more important about how consistent those servers are. How consistent the resolve.conf is and on my Linux servers. I want to make sure they're all going to the right DNS servers. I want to make sure the host files look the same and should always be the same, right? Consistency is what brings availability, because people forget things. When people are doing these things manually, they forget to add this line here, add that line there, and then all of a sudden when your production traffic goes to that server, the server goes to a grinding halt because it can't connect to your LDAP server. Lots of various little things can occur because people didn't type something or didn't put something in. Configuration management solves that. Really, your goal should be to automate everything, right? That's where SaltStack comes in handy because it has a very wide range of what it can automate. Like I said, this not only decreases provisioning time, but brings in consistency, right? So one of the things you should automate is server configuration. I talked about the resolve.conf, talked about the host files. Excuse me. There's a lot of room for automating the configuration of your server, right? I'm going to kind of go through a few slides that are examples that I've used to automate my network configuration. I don't use DHCP. You can shoot me now if you want. But some of my stuff is manually configured with the IPs. I have to deploy the ifconfig files. Various reasons why I don't use DHCP. But it's not a preference. It's more I have to deal with certain things that other people decided. So here's my systems pillar, right? It's pretty basic. I have an Jinja template for if the grains equals the host name, right? Because when we provision a new server, you assign it a host name and you connect it up to the Salt master, right? So the host name should be pretty consistent. You might need to set that up. And you have an SSH port, some node groups, which I'll get into later, interfaces, default gateway, IP address, netmask, and MTU size. Now, this is pretty basic. I had to fit it into a slide. This can get pretty big. If you have a whole bunch of systems in this file, you can kind of set up nice little if, else if statements, right? And I think when I was looking this up, I noticed something saying an include statement for pillars as well. So in theory, you can actually have a file that just has one system's configuration, say, if this host, include this file, right? It's kind of nice. Keeps things nice and organized. I didn't use that, obviously. Now, this is my state file. So this is not the whole state file, but a snippet of it. So a for loop, for interface and pillar systems interfaces. Set all these things up and use a template. I have a template, ifconfig-interfaces. So all of my ifconfig files look exactly the same. Consistency, right? It makes things a little faster. People don't have to go in and manually, create this file, check it in Subversion, and then it gets deployed. You pretty much have one file. You edit that file, you define that, and then you can use that file. If you do things like reusing host names, right? If you have a new server that you bring up and it has this role, has all those IPs, and then later you decide to deprovision it because you don't need it or whatever, but it'll need to have that same role. You keep that configuration in there. When you build it and you give it the same host name, you have everything you did before, right? So the benefits of this, it reduces the number of configuration files that need to be manually edited, right? You have one file where you specify the IPs. Again, if you're using something like DHCP, you don't have to worry about IPs, but things like DNS servers, not host names, but host file, any other kind of configuration, SSH port, as you saw in mine, any other kind of configuration item that you would want to make into a template and deploy that on specific servers, you could do that. You can stage the hosts in advance and provision them faster by having all the configurations ready to go. And most important, configurations are always the same. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, the root cause is, oh, well, this didn't happen because this guy didn't do it. Or this happened and this guy kind of forgot this one thing. You have one file. You can set up a peer review for that one file. You have one place where people can make mistakes. They're still going to make mistakes. But hopefully you can kind of reduce the amount of mistakes and make it a lot more harder for them to make those mistakes, right? And the files are always deployed in the same way. And to give you an example, a root cause analysis that I've seen come by is, well, the guy deployed a host file, but he kind of gave it 400 permissions, so nothing could read it. You eliminate little errors like that, right? That's a little thing, but it had a big impact to the application. The application couldn't read the host file, couldn't connect to the database. Everything went boom, right? Boom, no good. Automating the application install. So I talked about configuring a server automatically. Well, you should automate the application install too, right? Why stop at just the server? Just automate the whole thing. SaltStack has a lot of good ways of automating application install. In fact, the easiest is this one right here. You have, your MySQL-server package installed, right? Super easy. This is basic SaltStack, one of the first things you probably have done, right? And this works great if you have, a package manager like Yum and apt-get, and the package that you want to install is just through there. Super easy, right? Well, in the enterprise world, you use a lot of third-party software, right? And a lot of times that software isn't as easy to install by just a package, right? If you want to make it a package, you have to make it a package. And then, they start asking, well, how do you install this? And there's a lot of questions about support, and it just becomes difficult, right? So they don't always make it easy, but you should do it anyways. And might be somewhat difficult. You might have to create a wrapper script to make it happen. You might have to be very familiar with all the things that SaltStack can do. Or you might have to get some familiarity with expect, which I've avoided up to this point, but hopefully I don't have to. So SaltStack can be told to run a script. So a lot of third-party software, they'll give you an install script and say, all you got to do is just go run this. Well, that's great if you want to, manually run things whenever you're building a new server, which I don't know about you guys, but I don't like manual processes. I don't. SaltStack can be told to run that command for you, right, with the command.run module. So, it's pretty simple. You have your script name at the top. You have command.run. Unless would basically run this unless this is true, right? So you have it go check for something that's out there and see if it's there. If it's there, then, oh, well, you probably shouldn't run the script. Or if it's not there, then, hey, run it. And maybe that script, maybe you need to put a wrapper around that creates a flag file or whatever. One of the things I really like about SaltStack, when I started with CF Engine for configuration automation. And you'll see numerous times if you read anything about CF Engine, they very much tell you not to write custom scripts and don't do custom scripts because it's bad. If you got to do a custom script, you're doing it wrong, right? SaltStack doesn't seem to have that mentality to me. To me, it's like, yeah, sure, go for it. Yeah. Here's some things to help you do that. The unless and only if, which I'll show later, is very helpful in these types of scenarios, right? You'll notice the order is last. So what this does is this tells this script to run this last, right? So you probably want to make sure there's some dependencies, which are the require. You got the package JRE and the some guy user, right? You want to make sure those are there before you run the script. Maybe they're part of your application. Maybe your script fails if they're not there. And you can have it ordered the last thing. So that way you make sure that Salt does all of the other things it should do and then run this, right? My advice is to make all of your scripts stateful. So SaltStack has the ability to understand whether a script was successful or not, right? You saw it in this past slide here. where I have stateful is true. And really, all you have to do is in your script, if you wrote a custom script to install the software, which you could probably just do with a module, by the way, but if you did it through a shell script or something like that, you have good results. Changed equals yes, comment, hey, we did it, right? Bad results, change equals no, and oh no, something went wrong, right? Maybe you can even output what went wrong. When you run your high state, it'll output the results of your comment. So you can, if you run something manually, the high state manually, it'll tell you, hey, I didn't install this, and this is why. Or it'll tell you, hey, I did install this, and everything's okay. You don't need to do anything. Some third-party softwares come in tar files, right? Tar files are pretty easy. This is a super simple way of installing something through a tar. You got module run, archive.tar, right? You have the, I'm looking over here, even though I can see it here. The owner, username, group name, and XZF, You have the tar file. And change working directory. You might want to change to the directory you're extracting things. Usually tar files don't have full paths. In fact, they are designed not to at this point. Require username. Again, I need to know that that user is there before I extract all the files as his user ID, right? And again, you see, unless that's true, right? If that's true, don't extract this tar file. Only do it once, basically, is the idea. You could do, with that unless, you could do lots of things. This is basically a simple shell command. You can have a Python script do something. You could have this do whatever you want. It's really up to you. And once you've installed the applications, why stop at installing? Why don't you configure the applications automatically too, right? We can configure a server automatically, deploy host files and resolve.confs, right? Obviously, I use those files a lot since I'm mentioning them a lot. But you could do this for your software that you're installing too. I took a cheap, easy way out and took the my.conf, right, for MySQL. I have a source file, which I have templatized. And really in there it just has, a couple curly brackets says listen IP and another curly bracket, and it's pretty basic in this example. You have the user, the group, the mode, and you have the IP. And this is pulling the IP address off the minion, right? And I actually use this in my for my website when I was running it on WordPress. I use this for installing MySQL. It works great. Some applications require you to run a command. The example here is EMC's, what's it called? Power path, right? Which, by the way, after working on this slide, I realized that there's a power path module, so you don't really need to do this anymore, but it's a good example. With this, it's command.run. The name is, the command, right? But only if you don't find a license already there, right? EMC prereg -list grep4 no such file. If you do that and there's no license, go ahead and license it. Now, here in this example, it's a defined in the state file, but you can make this a pillar. You can make it a grain. You can make it whatever you want and use that. And that's one of the cool things I really like about SaltStack is you can make your state files just like templates too, right? They're set up and use your pillars to really define that information. Another chance for, that was build and provisioning, lots of things you could do with that, right? But another very human error prone process is change execution, right? So in a lot of places, a lot of enterprise places, changes are executed manually, right? When you need to install an RPM, someone logs in the server, maybe they type yum, maybe they type RPM-I, right? A lot of places that is true, right? And I believe that you should 100% automate that, right? There's no reason with tools like SaltStack and CF Engine that should still be a manual process because people are going to forget things. People will, if you give a list of 10 commands for people to run, and you give it to 100 people, I bet you not everyone's going to run it exactly the same. And when you're talking about super sensitive environments that need 4 nines, 5 nines availability, you can't really have someone just make a mistake, a simple mistake. Even something as simple as rolling out the host file could bring down production, right? If it's manually done, that's for sure. Well, there's my list of couple of RCAs, right? My host file with incorrect permissions. And another one is, when people install an application or update an application, a lot of times they tend to forget to update the config file. When you automate all of that, you've automated it, right? So you don't have to worry about people forgetting. The only time you have to worry about people forgetting is when they're, checking in the Salt configuration and the package and all of that stuff when they're defining in Salt, which you could build processes around reviewing that because they're not doing that live at that moment, right? So automated state runs. With SaltStack, you can have each server pull the desired states and update automatically through a cron job. As I was writing this, I did a little more looking up, and there's the scheduler, which is probably the better way of doing this. But hey, whatever. Cron jobs work too. It's whatever. If it works, it works. And this is great if you're running a lot of servers, right? If you're running a lot of servers, have them pull the state automatically and just take care of it, right? This is really good when you're running software like, let's say, Apache. And you can deploy a configuration and take it down and restart it gracefully, right? This is perfect for those types of environments where you can take a server out of rotation real easily without affecting traffic, and you deploy it and bring it back in rotation, and everyone's happy. You can have this done all automatically. However, when you start having all of your servers do this automatically and you deploy something that should go to all servers, you should probably make sure you stagger that schedule across your servers. Make sure you don't take them all down at the same exact time because, well, that's not good. You want to stagger that. And there's a couple ways of staggering that. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later. Yeah, so that was my pro tip, is make sure you stagger your schedule. Now, the cold hard reality, especially in the financial services world, is automatic state runs is not feasible for every application, right? If you're running things like Apache where you could do a graceful restart, it's great. When when you stop your application and people lose a couple $1 million, not so great, right? So in those environments, maybe it's not a good idea to automate it. And really, I'm not going to tell you which ones are good and which ones aren't good because it really depends on your environment. My advice would be to automate it everywhere you can. And you might have to do a few things to make it happen. You might have to, work with your networking team to say, hey, how can I have SaltStack, call an API request to take a server out of rotation from the load balancer, right? How can I do these things to automate it? But it's not feasible in every case. And, it's okay not to automate it in every case. There might be some places where you don't want to automate it. But that's not an excuse to do manual processes. Even if you don't automate things, I like to call this semi-automated, right? You could still have someone log into the server and run a high state, or they could log into the master, target that specific server, and run a high state after it's been taken out of rotation. If that's, taking it out of rotation during a change is manual, right? You could do that. And I recommend making sure that those critical systems where you can't have that second or 31 seconds of downtime a year, you should probably look at doing this, right? Or at least start here and then move to the fully automated later, right? Get a little used to semi-automating all of your changes in production and then go into a fully automated. Now, this only works, and actually I totally skipped over some pieces, but the automated and semi-automated only really works if you embrace this whole configuration management from end to end throughout your environment. If you have it 100% automated in development, 100% automated in test, and 100% automated in production, you can hash out a lot of issues in test and development that might pop up in production, right? So if you automate it all the way through, you don't have a surprise in production saying, hey, you did this wrong. Follow the same practices you would do if you're deploying any other kind of code, right? This is one I really like, which is use test equals true. So if you're not automating the high state in every environment, you should use test equals true, right? Test equals true will basically do a dry run. So it'll test all of your state files, all the pillars, all of the configuration, and perform everything like you're running a high state, but it's a dry run. It doesn't actually make any changes. This is really cool. I recommend using this for the environments where you have to, maybe run high state manually, right? And you can use test equals true by default. So a lot of times, you might say, oh, well, all right, guys, we all have to run test equals true whenever we deploy this in production. But people tend to forget things, right? Which is the whole reason you have configuration automation, right? But you can actually specify in the minion configuration file, test equals true. What this does is anytime someone runs a high state, it just does the dry run and outputs it as a dry run, right? In order to actually run the high state, you have to specify test equals false, right? So good way of kind of protecting your production from people just kind of doing their own thing, right? Now, if they know it's there, they can just run test equals false, but they had to actually think about it to do it, right? Now, my next best practice is keep things well organized, right? Organization helps you keep things a little bit more clean and really helps you provide that consistency. You'll hear me say consistency a lot throughout this because I really believe that consistency is what gives you high availability. More than, double architectures, where this could fail over to here and all that stuff, right? Consistency makes your servers work better because they're consistent from server to server. If you have traffic fail over from site to site, if that second site doesn't have something that the first one did, well, you have failures, right? So with keeping things organized, well organized, I suggest using more than just the base environment, right? So SaltStack has the ability to partition out state files and pillars into multiple environments. In most enterprises, you'll find a lot of different applications, right? You'll find, I have an application and I need Apache and I need an, Tomcat and I need a host file that specifically says this, and then there's another application, they need the same types of stuff, but it's a little bit different. So by using other base environments or other environments than just base, sorry, getting tongue-tied, you can really get fine-grained with your states and pillars and templates and have kind of the same states and pillar files, but different templates. Maybe the pillars aren't going to be the same. Kind of depends, right? Use your best judgment. Here's an example. I have my base with asterisks because I want all servers to have screen because I love screen. It's the best command ever. You have the operations users. You probably need them on your servers. Every now and then, they might need to log in. You have your App 1 development environment, your App 2 development environment, and you have your App 1 and App 2 servers, right? And this is real basic. It's a host file. Below is the file structure, right? You have your salt states directory. You have your base environment directory. You have your App 1 dev environment directory and your App 2 dev. You have your host files underneath that, right? Now these could be, you could make these templates and have pillars and do all that fancy stuff with this. But if it's just a real generic host file, maybe you just make a host file and have it in that directory, and in that environment gets that host file. In the other environment, they get a different host file. But it's all kind of the same. It's all deployed the same way with the same state files, all right? To define a new environment, pretty easy. You just go into the master configuration, find file roots, and append your new environment, right? Another one I really like to use is node groups. So environments are great, but node groups I think are a little bit better. Using them both together is great, right? You can define a environment for a specific application, and then you can use node groups. And node groups is a collection of servers defined by either a pillar, a grain, host names, a range, or even a subnet. If you have a specific class of servers that are in a specific subnet, you can say, well, I want all the servers in this subnet to be in this node group. And with node groups, you can, well, have specific configurations, right? In app1.dev, well, this isn't a great example because I have app1 and app2 dev in different environments, but whatever. App1.dev, app1 web servers is a node group, right? I don't have to define it by a host name. Now, I don't know about you guys, but in a lot of environments I've seen, they don't really have host names that make any sense whatsoever to what that application does, right? It'll like have a number, or it'll just say host, and it's really kind of a generic abbreviation. App servers are all app servers. Well, okay, is the app server a web server, or is the app server running Tomcat, running, JBoss? What's it doing? What is that app server? App servers are app servers, right? Node groups are a great way to organize all of your different servers and place them into a group where you can define specific states to run on them, right? You can have Nginx, PHP and WordPress in one. You can have Nginx, UWSGI and Django in the other, right? And you can define this on node groups. And with node groups, you can actually say, hey, Salt, go run a high state on just this node group. Don't run it across the board, across my entire production environment. Just run it on this specific node group, right? And you can have node groups by a lot of different things. Here's another example, right? I have host names for my web servers, right? I used a grain for my app servers and a pillar for my database servers. Now you notice in my previous system pillar file, I put a node group in there, right? So on that server, I specified that that server has a pillar for a specific node group, right? In your Salt master configuration, you can define additional node groups and have it based on a pillar. So you have that one file where you can go in and edit everything, and you're defining what that server's IPs are, what, and what packages are installed on that, and tons of other little things that let your imagination run wild, right? The last one is a subnet, which you guys probably figured out. I have a question.
In the second line, did you define a custom grain?
You can.
With name node group?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. Basically, to define grains, right, you have Etsy, Salt, and then I think it's just grains, right? And in there, you just define your grain. Same thing with a pillar. Pillar, grain, doesn't really matter. It's kind of up to you on what you want to use. But yeah, you define that grain, and then bam, that server is in that node group. And you can get real inventive with this, right? If you look at the names, I have web servers, app servers, database servers, and then servers, right? So I have the web servers in a specific node group. I have the database servers in a specific node group. And then I have a node group that has all of the servers. Because, well, maybe sometimes I want to execute something on all servers, and sometimes I want to execute something on only a subset. You could have two sets of app servers. You can have app servers region 1, app servers region 2, have things, or just app servers, right? You can execute on all of them, or just region 1, just region 2. You can get very inventive with this. Now, for me, I like to split my business application, right? So this application has this goal, and they all have their sets of servers. I like to have them by environment, and then the use of that server as a node group, right? And obviously, I'm appending the app1 to it as well, right? This lets me get very well organized and execute things on specific sets and make sure who gets what, right? And now for some architectural considerations, right? So SaltStack is great. Provides lots of configuration automation, and it's great. But it only works when it's running, right? It only is going as good as the server it's running on if you're only running one server. Now, first thing I recommend is spreading the load, right? In large environments, you're probably going to have development servers, you're going to have test servers, you probably have at least 2 production sites, most likely, if you have any kind of disaster recovery, right? Which, by the way, if you're worried about HA, you should have disaster recovery. At least 2 sites. And, you know, personally, I think you should probably just run a master server for each environment. You know, run a master server for your dev environment, run a master server for your test environment, and run one for each of your production environments, right? The trick is just making sure what goes where, right? You can test out your Salt configuration in the development, and then, you know, do your change requests, which if you're in an enterprise, you're probably going to have change requests, right? Do your change requests, deploy that configuration to the Salt master in test, and have it, you know, deploy out. I personally like running development and test automatic high states because, you know, it's development and test. Who really cares if it breaks development and test for 2 seconds, right? It's not as important as production. But, you know, maybe production's not completely automated, right? Maybe production doesn't run the high state automatically. And if you do have 2 master servers, 1 in each location, you can also run multi-master, right? So you can configure SaltStack as of version 0.16 to have multiple masters. And it's pretty easy, actually. All you got to do is go into the minion configuration, define the 2 master servers, and here's the tricky part. You have to make sure they have the same key, the master key, and the same roots and pillars. Now, the file roots and pillars isn't a hard requirement, but it's kind of a good idea if you're going to sync up to 2 master servers that they have the same configurations, right? This is pretty easy if you're using something like source control and you just deploy your source to both sides at the same time, right? As opposed to other things where you're like, oh no, I can't do that. I can't do both sides at the same time. You might really want to do it in this case. So that way you have consistency on your masters, right? And some other stuff. So I'm flying through this, and it's probably because I'm nervous, but I actually was taking long when I practiced this. Some other pro tips, right? Don't become so dependent on SaltStack that you can't fix things without it, right? I think you guys were all probably at the whatchamacallit, earlier in the morning when Thomas from LinkedIn said, you know, make sure you don't rely on it so much that you can't fix things, right? And that pretty much rings true. I totally did not steal this from him. I had this before he said that. But, you know, maybe Salt goes down, and maybe you have to go fix a production issue manually. If you're executing all your changes through high states and you're executing all your changes, you know, through automatic high states, don't say, oh crap, I can't do it when there's a production issue just because, you know, Salt's not available to you. Although if you do it right, you should be all right. Keep your implementation as simple to support as possible, right? High availability, in my mind, yeah, you have the architecture, and that's important, right? But above the architecture, you also have processes and people. People have to support this environment, right? And if they don't understand the environment, how are they supposed to support it? So if you can keep your Salt implementation as simple as possible, but still get done what you need to get done, then that gives you a lot more range and, you know, generally brings a higher availability throughout your environment. Keep it well organized. That kind of goes to keeping it simple, right? If it's well organized, then it's usually probably simple for people to understand. If it's all over the place, then, you know, people are going to go in and they're going to mess it up. You know, unless you have super strict controls and only this one guy can use it because he's the only one who understands it. It doesn't really work well when you have a team of 20, 30, 100 people trying to do their job, right? Keep it well organized. Keep it simple. Use test equals true like your life depends on it, because, well, it might. If you run something and it breaks production, well, you got to explain why it broke production, right? If you use test equals true and you see that dry run failed, well, you just saved your own butt, right? CYA. Use source control. So I don't know if any of you guys went to the one where LinkedIn was talking about at scale. It sounded like they use source control all the time for their salt states and pillars. And I highly recommend doing that, right? This is code. You know, the configuration that you're putting in is just like any other code. You know, you want to use source control. And like any other code, it only gets better when you use source control. If you're going to use SaltStack, use it. You know, automate or at least semi-automate everything. You know, don't just say, okay, well, you know, we're just going to do the servers and we'll still install the applications manually. Well, when you install something manually, you give room for human error. Human error breaks things. It's actually like the #1 cause for lots of things. It's kind of interesting. Keep an eye on new features. SaltStack, changing all the time. When I was creating this deck, I was like, oh, I need to look up and see if there's a better way of doing what I'm doing in here. There was like 10 of them, because it changes all the time. This is very fast. And actually, the CEO said, you know, hey, we've been around since 2011. Well, it's 2014, right? And from where it started to where it is today, there's been a ton of changes. And it's changing all the time. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on new features, which it's a good thing you're here because, well, you're doing that, right? And check out the modules. There's some pretty cool modules out there. Like I said, through a simple way of licensing the EMC power path because, well, I needed it done super quick. I didn't feel like writing a module for it. But, when I went out and looked, there was a module for it. So I could have saved myself some time if that was there at the time I did this, which maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of cool modules. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm like 3 minutes under. I'm pretty good. So yeah, like I said, I have a blog. You can check it out. You can follow me on Twitter, whatever. If you didn't like this, just yell at me. And if you have questions, ask.
LinkedIn said, some quote was like 99% of the stuff's already been written in a module.
Yeah.
Has that been your experience as well?
A lot of times, yeah. Like, to be honest, the tar one, I just had to figure out recently. I'm like, oh, how do I do this? And I went and looked, and it's not there's a module for tar, I had to call it. It's not exactly a state yet, but hey, it's out there. The power path one, I don't think I actually looked when I had to do that, but I wish I did if it was there, So yeah, I would say there's a lot of modules that are out there that I don't even know half of them, So I definitely advise keeping an eye on them. Yeah?
Towards the beginning of your presentation, you talked a lot about pulling configs or pulling hash states from the master.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you pull from the minions instead of pushing the master?
It depends on what you're doing, right? If you're doing the automated deployment where you do a cron job, my suggestion of the cron job, you're pulling from the master, right? But if you're doing something manually, like you want to log in and you want to run something across a node group, you would do that from the master. So you would push it from the master.
Why even for automated deployment on the cron job when the minions to pull from the master instead of running it on the master?
You could do that. It's kind of up to you. I actually do it on the minions because what I do is I just have a state file that says deploy this file into cron.d. So then it's always running from the minions, right?
Yeah, like imagine if someone replaced your NC host file with something else.
Yeah.
You can pull in always from cron or state. You can pull in a replacement that says that's not right. Replace. I always fix my problem because someone added to my NC host. I said, hey, they're doing that. You keep the state the same.
Yeah.
And that's why you pull from the minion from the master.
There you go. He's got a good answer. I like his answer. Any other questions? All right, I guess that's it. Thank you.